Issei Sagawa was born on April 26, 1949, in Kobe, Hyogo, Japan. Born to a very wealthy family, he was birthed prematurely and under the normal weight. So small, in fact, he reportedly could fit in the palm of his father's hand. As he grew, however, he was immediately faced with health issues along with digestive problems. These problems would only make Issei turn away from being social with his peers and turn to more introverted activities such as drawing and reading. With that said, it wouldn't be long until Sagawa's twisted desires would come to surface. According to Sagawa himself, later detailed in a book he would write, he claimed his first cannibalistic urges appeared in the first grade. Recollecting it all in his book, he wrote, "I was physically weak from the moment I was born. My legs were so skinny they looked like pencils. It was the first grade when I noticed the quivering meat on a male classmate's thighs. I'm not homosexual, but I just thought to myself that they looked delicious. So from around that time I entered junior high school. I became obsessive with the Western actress Grace Kelly, an obsession that lasted throughout all of high school. That was the beginning of my infatuation with Occidental people, or people from the West. Before I realized it, tall, healthy-looking Western women became the trigger for my cannibalistic fantasies. I guess that my infatuation came from the fact that I was short, ugly, and had an inferiority complex, and therefore sought people who are the opposite of myself." He went on to explain that his cannibalistic desires weren't always murderous in nature. Oddly enough, he would mention this several times, almost seemingly deliberate to lessen the grotesque acts he would later commit. Issei had this to say, "Eventually I began feeling a strong sexual desire to bite these women. Not to kill them or eat them per se, merely to gnaw on their flesh. It was merely a form of sexual desire. It wasn't like I wanted to eat someone every time I was hungry. But you know how you tend to feel a strong sexual desire when you've eaten a full meal? That's when I would feel the urge to eat a woman." It has never been on record or confessed by Sagawa if his mother or father knew of these fantasies. However, in 1972, when Issei Sagawa was 24 years old, he started to consider acting upon his demented cannibal fantasies. Planning to enact this, Sagawa traveled to Tokyo and quietly entered the home of a young German woman, all with the intentions on feasting on a small morsel of her flesh. However, this plan would be foiled when the German woman would overpower Issei, who was only 4'9" during the time. Subduing the monster until the police could arrive, he was ultimately charged with attempted sexual assault. None of the parties involved were even aware of the disgusting cannibal fantasy that he had attempted to live out, or the harm that he intended to cause this woman. Unfortunately, Sagawa's very wealthy father stepped in and bribed the female victim with a financial offer settlement to get the charges dropped. Being a very large sum of money, the woman reluctantly accepted the money, and Issei walked away a free man, not even aware that his son was not only a monster, but would attempt the same crime not even 10 years later. In 1981 in Paris, France, Issei was studying and furthering his school career. That was, until he noticed his urges grew even more. He later wrote, "My cannibalistic urges showed no signs of slowing down. Every night I would bring a prostitute home with the intentions of shooting them in the back of the head when they washed their private parts at the bidet. I tried several times, but for some reason my fingers froze up and I couldn't pull the trigger. From around that time, it became less about wanting to eat them and more of an obsession of the idea itself. I had to carry out the ritual of killing a woman, no matter what. Unfortunately, this disgusting human being would do just that. And that victim's name would be Renee Hartbelt. Trying to think of a clever lie, he told Renee he was trying to find someone to help him with a poetry reading project for school. Not even remotely aware of the gruesome gore that this girl would encounter, or the horrible things he had planned for her. Luring Renee back to his apartment to, quote, work on his school project, they ate dinner and worked as they bonded together. That's when Sagawa said he wanted her to be the first official candidate, as he put it, describing her beauty to be something he's never seen before. Similar to what he would do with the prostitutes he frequently preyed upon, he aimed the gun at the back of her head as she read the poetry for his school project, unfortunately pulling the trigger that time. He detailed this all in the disgusting book that he wrote and published, even saying he had passed out from it all right after selfishly taking Renee's life. When he awoke from his slumber, however, he would finally embark upon the disturbing urges he had always craved. He began to feed on her remains. This is going to be a rough one, bear with me. Going into detail, he said, quote, biting into her skin was impossible for my teeth, since they weren't sharp enough. So he described purchasing a butcher knife. Whether he did this before the murder or after, I couldn't exactly find an answer for. What he did describe doing with that butcher knife, though, was the stuff of nightmares. This is what Sagawa recalled himself. Viewer discretion advised. The first thing I did was cut into her buttock. That part looked the most delicious. But no matter how deep I would cut, all I would see is the fat beneath the skin. It looked like corn. It took a while to actually reach the red meat. The moment I saw the meat, I tore a chunk off with my fingers and threw it in my mouth. It was a truly historical moment for me. It only gets worse from here. After consuming most of her buttocks, he began to butcher and feed off the meat of her breasts and even some of her face. When he finished with that, he moved to the thighs, neck, and feet. Almost like a trophy kill or butchering an animal he'd hunted. He meticulously began to package and preserve some of her flesh in his refrigerator. Even going as far as to take pictures of her remains. Whether this was to preserve the moment for him or as a trophy is simply unknown. Oftentimes, many depraved individuals and serial killers such as himself often take some form of trophy or artifact from their victims. Oddly enough, he would later try to justify all of this in his book, constantly expressing how he would, quote, never wanted to kill her, only to consume some of her flesh. Once her remains began to spoil, as he put it, he attempted to dispose of the body in a nearby park. Due to his small stature and not wanting to look conspicuous, he divided her remains into 2 suitcases. However, a French couple in the park had noticed this and almost immediately reported it, detailing how they even had witnessed him dumping the remains in a nearby body of water. With all of this being said and done, even with all the reports, even with being caught and arrested a second time, this still wouldn't spell the end for Issei Sagawa and his evil crimes. His wealthy father had stepped in yet again, this time hiring the best lawyers he could find. And unfortunately for Renee Hartbelt, she would never receive the justice she deserved. After a 2-year-long battle, the lawyers Sagawa's father had hired got exactly what they wanted. Issei Sagawa, being held in French custody awaiting trial, was declared insane and transferred to a mental institution. Soon after, he was interviewed by Enuhiko Yamota, a famous Japanese author that had been very well known. After interviewing Sagawa for a lengthy amount of time, he wrote and published Into the Fog. Not only did the book take everyone by storm and sell like hotcakes, this inadvertently made Issei Sagawa famous and somewhat popular himself, all with little to no credit or respect for the innocent woman he had just butchered. Soon after, Sagawa was transferred from the French facility he was admitted to Matsuzawa Hospital in Japan for psychiatric evaluation. Every Japanese medical professional that had interviewed and talked with him all came to the same exact conclusion. A conclusion that had been very different from the recent French diagnosis. Issei Sagawa was completely sane the whole time. Not only was this breathing monster completely sane, they deemed all the ungodly acts to be all sexual in nature. Something he had not only had urges to do, but something he took great pleasure into doing. However, this all created a giant legal mess, for both parties, that is. France, where he had been initially arrested, had very different laws and opinions than the Japanese authorities that had now held Sagawa in custody. All of this led France to drop all charges and seal all documentation and evidence, meaning that not one shred of paperwork, evidence, or even documentation could be shared with the Japanese authorities. This meant Sagawa, having just butchered a woman in cold blood a few years prior to this, was able to walk free. Without the evidence and charges from the French authorities that handled the case initially, there was physically nothing the Japanese authorities could do. Legally being able to discharge himself from the hospital, Sagawa walked away scot-free on April 12th, 1986. A completely free man with 0 charges. Now a free man, Sagawa reaped the benefits of fame the previous book had garnered him, even writing a manga himself, graphically detailing the previous statements I had previously read off, and drawing them in great detail. Physical copies of this book are still sold to this day, some of the original copies even selling for hundreds of dollars on eBay. While I contemplated purchasing this said book for the sake of this video, I couldn't do it in good conscience. Sagawa became a low-level Japanese celebrity, even starring in B-list movies and trying to promote his cannibal fantasy manga that he wrote, going as far as to create, quote, art of what Renee's dismembered body looked like. So not only did this absolute waste of skin and oxygen murder an innocent woman, he talked about how much he loved doing it, and even somehow garnered fame by doing so. Unless the initial party that arrested him decided to charge him, the French government, that is, there was legally nothing anyone could do to prosecute him. Once his fame dissipated and his wealthy parents passed, Sagawa resorted to living off government assistance before being diagnosed with cerebral infarction in 2013. The few family members that still semi-cared about him looked after him before his fortunate passing on November 24th, 2022. And might I add, good riddance. Not only did this absolute vile creature steal the life of a young, talented Renee Hartbelt, a woman who I'm sure had an amazing career and life ahead of her. Not only did he steal that, he walked away and got to live the rest of his life scot-free. I don't like giving people this any form of attention, but telling this story, I hope to shine a light not only for Renee's sake, but so people can be aware of just how little they know about people around them. There can be an Issei Sagawa anywhere at any point. It could be your boss, your coworker, your friend, even your family member. It's important not to glorify a story like these, but to villainize the monster that does them. If hell does exist, I can only pray that Sagawa has handed his fair share in there. And might I add, this was an incredibly difficult story to research, talk about, and tell you guys about it. Luckily, our story ends here. I wish we had a better ending, but unfortunately it doesn't always pan out that way. This chapter has come to an end. That is, until our next ghost story.